Certain and Uncertain, Chapter 37, The Request. It was the Friday before school started back up. They were planning one last hurrah before they had to split for the majority of the week. A trip to the beach, a beach house rented by Gwen's father. The plumber's helpers were even coming for a break from the academy. It was set to be quite a bit of fun, and yet Gwen was nervous. "Let's go! We're already late!" She ushered Jen and Ethan towards the car. Jen laughed. "Why are you so tense? It's only 8 in the morning. We're making good time." Gwen frowned. "We have been planning this for a month. The rest of the team is already there. If we don't hurry, something's going to happen to stop us from going entirely." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" "Last time we tried to do something, the incursions invaded. Come on, something always happens. I just want a fun trip to the beach with no added stress." But even as she spoke, a soft whir filled the air and 2 figures in blue robes materialized. They both bowed, the female with some difficulty as she was carrying a large egg. She also looked distinctly unhappy. The other figure, Jen guessed he was male due to the mustache, but she had learned not to assume, spoke. "Hello. I am Ambassador Zwavinal of Bellwood. We are seeking Jen Tennyson." Gwen swore under her breath as Kevin got out of his car and Jen stepped forward in front of Ethan and Gwen. "That would be me," she said with a slight wave. The ambassador smiled. The woman bowed again. "It is an honor to be in your presence. We, the people of Bellwood, are in desperate need of your help." Gwen grumbled under her breath as Kevin tried to hold his laughter in. He wrapped his stone arm around her and she sighed, hiding her face in his shoulder. "We are here to implore you to help us." Jen raised her hands. "No imploring necessary. What exactly do you need?" Zwavinal bowed low. "Our world is finally making peace with the Pentaphage, but we require an outside envoy to bring our greatest treasure to them as a peace offering." Kevin frowned. "Treasure?" He sounded very interested in this now. Gwen glared at him behind her sunglasses. Zwavinal nodded to the woman who hadn't been introduced yet. She looked down, solid blue eyes sad as she pushed a button on the egg in her hands. It opened and revealed a small creature that looked very much like a dollop of whipped cream with bright blue eyes. It trilled happily at being released and flew out of the egg. "May I present our crown prince, the Tiffin?" Zwavinal gestured grandly to the child Llewellyn. The woman, however, looked even sadder. Gwen frowned, setting down her bag and stepping up to the woman as the Tiffin flew around Ethan's head a few times. "I didn't get your name." The woman looked up at her. Gwen was a few inches taller than her. "I am Cicely, she who bore him." Gwen frowned. The Tiffin's mother looked close to tears. The Tiffin decided it was bored, circling Ethan's head and swooped around Jen instead, who laughed lightly until it reached the Omnitrix, which sparked. She covered it with her other hand as Zwavinal frowned. "Are you quite well?" Jen nodded, keeping the Omnitrix covered as the Tiffin flew to Gwen and circled her too. "I'm fine." Her left eye twitched slightly and Gwen's eyes narrowed at her cousin, but she shook her head minutely, her meaning clear, not in front of the aliens. Gwen nodded as the Tiffin nestled into her arms. Zwavinal nodded too, a smile on his face. "Of course, all of your expenses will be paid for." He held up a small cube and Kevin stepped up to him, taking the cube from his hand. "Is that a gold credit cube? I've never seen one before. They have no spending limit." He laughed slightly. Zwavinal nodded. "Of course, only the best will do for the hero of 100 worlds." Jen went pink and Ethan looked her over. Sometimes he forgot that she was such a big shot out in space. Gwen, though, pointed out a problem. "How are we supposed to get the Tiffin to the Pantophage? We sent Lou's ship back to him, and Grandpa Max's old skiff only seats 3. Kevin raised an eyebrow at the revelation that they had a spaceship on standby. Jen shrugged at her cousin, but Zwavinal nodded. "We will provide you with a ship." He raised his hands, and a ship materialized on the street, its engines nearly crushing a few trees close to the road. Kevin's mouth dropped open. Gwen looked skeptical. It wasn't a pretty ship. In fact, it looked a little pieced together. "We're gonna fly in that?" Ethan asked, looking just as skeptical as Gwen. "Hell yeah, we are. That's a Tachyon 930. Ugly on the outside, but one of the most powerful engines on the market. I'm driving." He raced up the back of the ship. "Road trip." Jen shook her head, shrugging at Gwen. "We'll make sure he gets there safely, I promise." Zwavinel bowed low. "I knew we could rely on you, Jen Tennyson. You have my people's gratitude." Cicely handed the egg-like pod the Tiffin had been in to Ethan and bowed too. But Ethan spotted a few white tears drop to the ground as she did. He frowned. Gwen picked up her bag and followed Kevin onto the ship, pausing to wait for them. Ethan followed her, and Jen brought up the rear. As she passed Gwen, who was still holding the Tiffin, the Omnitrix sparked again. Gwen lowered her voice to a mutter. "What's going on?" Jen shook her head, just the barest amount, as they got all the way on board. No idea. She stepped around her cousin, looking around the ship as she made her way into the cockpit. Gwen frowned. A speaker she couldn't see beeped to life. "Gwen, come on. You should strap in before takeoff." She nodded down at the child in her arms. "We'll get through this, won't we, cutie?" The Tiffin trilled at her and burbled. She smiled slightly. Chapter 38. Malfunction. Ethan was excited. He'd been off Earth only once in his life. He'd gone with Jen to take her friend Riney, who turned out to be the leader of his entire planet and the Highbreed Supreme, back to his world. That had been in a different ship, though. It was sort of comforting to him to know that the ship Kevin was flying wasn't alive with a will of its own. The interior was also much more comfortable than the outside looked. In fact, it was quite plush. Kevin grinned. "This is a direct off the factory floor, with some custom mods to the interior. Oh, I love being friends with you, Jen." Jen rolled her eyes as Kevin looked at Kevin before looking back down at the Omnitrix. "Good to know it has its perks," she grumbled. "Everything okay with the watch?" Gwen asked as the Tiffin circled Ethan's head again. As he watched the stars rush by outside the window, Jen shrugged. "Nothing's different. I don't have any idea what happened." The Tiffin seemed to give up on distracting Ethan, who was mesmerized by the view, and flew over to Jen, who smiled at him. "Hey, little guy, you doing okay?" The dollop burbled at her and whistled, a high-pitched tone that had Gwen rubbing her ears. Jen laughed. "You're sweet, huh?" He whistled again, and the Omnitrix sparked to life, but this time, when the sparking stopped, the dial popped up and spun of its own accord, glowing bright green before dropping on its own as Jen cried out in surprise. Green light filled the cockpit, and Gwen leapt to her feet. She wasn't sure what she expected, possibly her cousin in the form of a Luoden. Maybe the Omnitrix had taken a sample from the Tiffin. What she, Kevin, and Ethan found, though, was a 6-foot-tall humanoid tiger. She was dressed in what looked like the same kind of outfit worn by female wrestlers on Earth, a pair of tight green shorts and what appeared to be a sports bra in the same color, sporting the Omnitrix symbol. Her eyes, bright green, as was usual for Jen's aliens, snapped open and she roared. The Tiffin squeaked in fear and hid behind Ethan as Jen ripped her seat out of its place and threw it. Kevin slapped on the autopilot as Jen roared again. He lunged at her, catching her around the neck from behind. "You're wrecking the interior!" She grabbed him and threw him hard. He slammed into the wall and nearly blacked out. Jen roared again. Gwen's hands lit up, and Ethan grabbed the Tiffin and stepped behind the redhead. "You need to calm down." The bipedal tiger turned on Gwen. She was sort of expecting another growl. She was not really expecting this transformation to be able to talk, just from what she'd seen so far about its animalistic behavior. "Let me tell you something, Gwen Tennyson!" She was yelling quite loudly, and the Tiffin whimpered and hid his face in Ethan's shirt. "Wrath is perfectly calm!" Gwen shook her head and flicked her hand at Wrath, as this transformation was apparently called. A bright pink bubble appeared around her head. "You need a timeout." Gwen quipped and Wrath growled. Wrath does not need a timeout, Gwen Tennyson! Wrath is gonna— Did I just use up all my air? And with that much more reasonably volumed question, Wrath's knees buckled and her eyes slipped closed as she slumped to the floor. Kevin pulled himself to his feet and rubbed the back of his head as Gwen let the bubble dissolve so that her cousin could breathe again, though she remained unconscious. Gwen frowned. That should have turned her back to normal. Gwen sounded very concerned. Ethan patted the Tiffin on his head and set him in one of the still-standing chairs. Wait here, buddy. Ethan stepped over to the large cat and began to attempt to heave her into a chair. She was a good foot taller than him, though, and could charitably be described as built like a brick wall. Kevin let him struggle, still nursing a headache from being thrown. Gwen ended up taking pity on him and lifted the large tiger into a seat with her powers. She kept the mana encircling the tiger, though, effectively tying her cousin down. Ethan frowned. Are you sure that's necessary? Gwen raised an eyebrow at him. She just attacked the ship, and then Kevin. Ethan frowned. Good point, but why though? Kevin had stepped over to the computer console. He was pulling up something on the extranet. She's an apoplexian, according to the ALDB. They're a pretty savage race. They're very open with their emotions, though most of the time that emotion is blinding rage, Kevin snorted. May have figured out why she attacked the first thing she saw. When apoplexians meet, they wrestle until one wins, establishing dominance. This is considered a friendly greeting on their world. Gwen nodded slightly. That does explain her going ballistic moment 1 when she transformed, but I've never seen this one before. She called herself Wrath. Why would the Omnitrix turn her into a new alien now? Kevin shrugged, but eyed the Tiffin, who had decided that Wrath was much more interesting than following orders. He was currently circling her head and trilling. Noisy. Wrath grumbled as she woke up. She blinked and struggled against the mana holding her. The Tiffin screeched and hid behind Ethan. Jen, can you understand me? Wrath glared at the redhead. Of course I understand you, Gwen Tennyson. Do you think I'm stupid? Kevin chuckled. Yep, thick as a brick. Jen growled. Kevin blinked. Did you just growl at me? You wanna fight, Kevin E11? She snarled at him. Struggling with the bonds, Ethan stepped in front of Wrath, who glared. Nobody wants to fight you, Jen. On instinct, he reached out and gently scratched under her chin. Her eyes flickered closed, her nose twitched, and a rumbling purr echoed through the ship. Gwen bit back her laughter. Kevin slapped a metal hand to his mouth to stop his own giggles. Oh, that is just precious. Gwen elbowed him. Not helping, Kevin. Jen, I need you to listen. You've become something called an apoplexian. Kevin looked it up in the ALDB. Ethan stopped scratching under Wrath's chin and Wrath frowned. The what? The Alien Life Form Database, Gwen supplied patiently. This species is powerful, argumentative, and extremely aggressive, and apparently likes getting scratched under their chins. Kevin chuckled as Ethan blushed, realizing how it must have looked. I used to have a cat. Gwen nodded, managing her own laughter much better than Kevin. Okay, I'm going to let you go now, but you have to keep calm. Control your anger. Wrath growled but nodded, and Gwen released her restraints. Wrath cracked her neck now that she was free and flexed her fingers, looking at the blade-like protrusion on the back of her hand with interest. Gwen frowned at her cousin. Maybe you should reboot the Omnitrix? You know, get back to normal? Jen seemed to roll the idea around her brain for a moment. Okay, but not because you told me to. Gwen was having flashbacks to Jen at 10 years old. She'd never wanted to do anything Gwen had wanted at that age, simply because Gwen had wanted it. She rubbed the bridge of her nose as she felt a headache coming on. Wrath slapped the Omnitrix. It beeped plaintively, but nothing else happened. Wrath frowned, then growled, Get off me! She roared in frustration as she tugged on the Omnitrix symbol. Did I mention they aren't the brightest stars in the universe? Kevin asked sarcastically as Jen managed to knock herself over in the attempt to remove the Omnitrix. Wrath hopped back to her feet. It's busted! Who else is hungry? Gwen stared at her as her cousin wandered away. Apparently, apoplexians were easy to distract, too. Ethan glanced at the others as the Tiffin chirped at Wrath. Of course Wrath likes meat. Wrath likes all kind of food, except vegetables. The Tiffin burbled something that sounded like a laugh. Ethan tilted his head at them. Are they talking? Gwen shook her head at Ethan. Honestly, best not to question it. Gwen was more concerned that Jen hadn't turned back into herself when she'd lost consciousness like she usually did. Kevin sat back in the driver's seat. He seemed to realize this wasn't business as usual. What do you think's keeping her as Wrath? He asked as he switched off the autopilot and took control again. Gwen frowned. No idea. She once got stuck as gray matter, but she eventually turned back on her own, but once she messed with the Omnitrix until it got her stuck as a different alien every week. We didn't see her for nearly a solid month, and Azimuth had to do a solid reset on the Omnitrix in person. Kevin nodded. Well, since this is a time-sensitive mission, if things don't work themselves out by the time we finish, we'll head to Galvin Prime. See if the First Thinker will help. Gwen squeezed his hand. Thanks, Kevin. He grinned, but they were interrupted by Wrath growling and sticking her head between them. Are you talking about Wrath? Gwen chuckled. Just worried about you, Fuzzball. Wrath seemed to decide that she was all right with the nickname and nodded slightly. Well, Wrath and the Tiffin are hungry. Kevin glanced up at the Tiffin floating next to Wrath's shoulder. I know a station on the way. Pretty good grub. We'll stop there. Sounds good, Kevin 11. Wrath grinned, a sharp-toothed, slightly unnerving smile as Ethan sat back down in one of the chairs and looked out at the stars. Wrath stalked over to him and sat down in front of him, leaning on his legs. He could tell they would soon go numb, but he didn't care all that much. What are you thinking about, Ethan Validus? You look sad. Wrath doesn't like it when you're sad. Ethan chuckled. Not sad. Sort of amazed. I've never been this far into space before. Pantophage was farther from Earth than the Highbreed homeworld and in the opposite direction. Do you like space? Wrath sometimes gets worried that you don't like being around because of all the crazy things that happen. Ethan looked down at the giant space tiger, currently looking up at him with her large head tilted back onto his lap. Wow, Kev wasn't kidding. You have no emotional filter right now. He breathed it and reached out to scratch her under her chin again, eliciting the same contented purring. No, I love being around you. Things can get a little bit crazy, but I'll get used to it. It's usually pretty fun, honestly. Wrath nodded, plucked Ethan from the chair, and sat him down in her lap. She was still facing the he was still facing the window, but she wrapped her arms around him. Wrath likes that answer. You can keep scratching, Wrath. Ethan held his giggles in and went back to his appointed task.